The gavel struck the podium, and the entire ballroom went silent. Eleanor Ashworth stood frozen on the small raised platform, her hands clenched together, as 300 pairs of eyes turned toward the man who had just outbid every other gentleman in the room. He had not blinked. He had not hesitated. Duke Sebastian Wolversley, the coldest and most sought-after bachelor in all of London, had just paid a sum that made grown men gasp, for a woman nobody in Mayfair had ever thought worth a second glance. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn as whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. She wore a dress borrowed from her cousin, a plain gray gown with no lace, no jewels, nothing to catch the candlelight the way the other women's gowns did. She had come to this charity event only because her aunt had begged her, insisting that even a girl with no dowry could do her small part for the War Orphans Fund. She had expected to stand on that platform for a moment, receive no bids at all, and quietly step down while the real prizes of the evening, the beautiful heiresses and titled ladies, drew the crowd's attention and their purses. Instead, the Duke had risen from his seat the moment the auctioneer called her name. 1,000 guineas, he had said, his voice flat and certain, as though he were purchasing a horse rather than a season of chaperoned company. The room had erupted into murmurs immediately. A young baron who had opened the bidding at 10 guineas sat back down, stunned into silence. Nobody dared challenge the Duke. Nobody ever did. Eleanor did not understand what was happening. She searched the crowd for her aunt, hoping to find some explanation in her face, but Mrs. Whitfield looked just as shocked as everyone else, her fan frozen halfway to her cheek. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she feared everyone could hear it. She was certain there had been some terrible mistake. Perhaps the Duke had meant to bid on the woman beside her, the golden-haired beauty who had been the talk of 3 seasons running. Perhaps he had simply misspoken, or perhaps this was some elaborate joke designed to humiliate her in front of all of society. She glanced at him, expecting to see amusement in his expression, the kind of cruel entertainment that men of his rank sometimes found in toying with those beneath them. But his face showed nothing at all, no smile, no smirk. His gray eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that unsettled her far more than mockery would have. The auctioneer, a portly man with a nervous laugh, cleared his throat twice before finding his voice again. Going once, going twice, sold to his grace the Duke of Wolversley. Applause followed, uncertain and scattered, as though the room did not know whether it had just witnessed a scandal or a miracle. Eleanor stepped down from the platform on legs that felt like water, and before she could retreat toward her aunt, the Duke was already crossing the floor to meet her. "Miss Ashworth," he said, offering a slight bow that seemed almost too formal for the circumstances. "I believe congratulations are customary, though I confess I am not certain which of us is meant to receive them." Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to let her voice shake even though her whole body trembled beneath her borrowed dress. "Your Grace, I believe there has been some confusion. Perhaps you intended to bid on Miss Hargrove. She was standing beside me." "I know exactly who was standing beside you," he replied. "I made no mistake." "Then I do not understand your purpose," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended. "I have no fortune, no connections worth mentioning, and nothing to offer a man of your position. If this is some manner of jest at my expense, I would rather you tell me now, so that I might leave with what little dignity remains to me." For the first time, something flickered across his face, not amusement, but something closer to surprise. "You believe I would spend 1,000 guineas on a jest? I believe men of your standing have done stranger things for far less reason." A murmur of laughter escaped him, quiet and brief, gone almost before it began. "You are not wrong about that, but I assure you, Miss Ashworth, my reasons are my own and they are not cruel ones. I would ask only that you allow me to explain myself in a more private setting, away from the ears of half of London." Eleanor glanced around and realized, with rising horror, just how many people were watching them, how many fans were raised to hide whispering mouths, how many eyes tracked every movement between herself and the Duke. She thought of her father, the late vicar of a small parish outside the city, and what he would have told her to do in such a moment. He would have told her to hold her ground with grace, even when the ground felt as though it might give way beneath her. "Very well," she said, "I will hear your explanation. But I warn you, your grace, I am not easily charmed, and I do not intend to be made a fool of twice in one evening." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and for a moment something almost like respect passed across his features. He led her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, near a bank of tall windows that looked out over the dark garden beyond. The music continued behind them, a waltz that seemed far too cheerful for the tension coiling in Alina's chest. She kept her back straight and her hands folded, determined not to let him see how unsteady she truly felt. "I will not pretend the bidding tonight was ordinary," the Duke began. "I understand how it must appear to you and to everyone in that room. A duke does not typically outbid an entire ballroom for a woman he has never formally met." "No," Alina agreed, "he does not. There are reasons behind my actions tonight that I am not yet prepared to share in full. I ask only that you trust I did not act out of cruelty, nor out of any wish to embarrass you." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "The arrangement, as I understand it, requires that you accompany me to a number of social engagements this season, under proper chaperonage, of course. Nothing more is expected of you than your company and your honesty. In return, the funds raised tonight will go entirely to the orphans' charity, and you will want for nothing during the length of our arrangement." Alina studied him, searching his face for some sign of the trick she felt certain must be hiding beneath his words. She found none, only that same steady, unreadable calm that seemed to be his permanent expression. "Forgive me, your grace, but I find it difficult to believe that a man such as yourself has no ulterior motive. Every person in that ballroom tonight believes you have humiliated yourself for my sake, or that you intend some scandal that will humiliate me instead. I do not wish to be the subject of London's gossip for reasons I do not even understand." "You will be the subject of London's gossip regardless of what I say tonight," he said, not unkindly. "That is simply the nature of what has already happened. The only question that remains is whether you wish to face it with resources and protection, or without them." It was, Alina had to admit, a fair point, however unwelcome. She thought of her aunt's modest household, of the mounting bills since her father's passing, of the future that had seemed to narrow with each passing month into something small and gray, much like the dress she now wore. She thought, too, of the strange, searching look in the Duke's eyes when he had first bid on her, a look that did not match the cold reputation that preceded him through every drawing room in the city. "I will need time to consider your proposal," she said finally. "I do not make decisions that will affect my reputation and my family's reputation without careful thought." "That is a wise position," the Duke said, inclining his head. "I would think less of you if you agreed without hesitation." Before Alina could respond, her aunt appeared at her side, breathless and pale, her fan working furiously against the heat of her own alarm. "Alina, my dear, I must speak with you at once." The Duke bowed once more, his gaze lingering on Alina a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. "I will call upon you tomorrow, Miss Ashworth, if you will permit it. Until then, I wish you a peaceful evening, though I suspect peace may be difficult to find tonight." He walked away, and the crowd parted for him as though he commanded the very air around him. Alina watched him go, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers yet, and a strange, unfamiliar flutter beneath her ribs that she refused to name. Her aunt gripped her arm the moment he was out of earshot. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? Do you understand what this means? The Duke of Wolversley does not attend these events, let alone bid on anyone, let alone a girl with no dowry and no name to speak of. This will be the talk of every drawing room from here to Bath by morning." "I did nothing, Aunt. I only stood where I was told to stand." "That will not matter to anyone tomorrow," her aunt said, glancing nervously around the room, where clusters of guests had already begun whispering behind gloved hands and painted fans. "They will say you schemed for it. They will say you set your cap for him months ago and orchestrated the entire affair." "Oh, Alina, what are we to do?" "We are to go home," Elinor said, with more calm than she truly felt. "And we are to wait until morning, when perhaps matters will seem less impossible than they do tonight." But even as she said the words, she doubted them. She could feel the eyes of the room still upon her, could hear the low hum of speculation building around her name like a storm gathering on the horizon. Somewhere across the ballroom, she caught sight of a stunning woman in emerald silk watching her with an expression that was not curiosity nor amusement, but something colder and far more calculating. Elinor did not know her name yet, but she would come to know it soon enough, and to understand exactly how much trouble that single look promised. For now she allowed her aunt to steer her toward the door, past the whispering crowd, past the golden-haired beauty who had expected to be chosen, and instead stood watching Elinor's departure with unreadable eyes. The night air outside was cool and sharp after the heat of the ballroom, and Elinor drew in a long breath, trying to steady the wild rhythm of her own heart. She did not know, as their carriage pulled away from the grand townhouse and into the quiet streets of Mayfair, that her life had already changed beyond recognition. She did not know that the Duke's reasons for bidding on her that night reached back years, into a debt of honor so old and so deeply buried that even he had not fully understood its weight until the moment he saw her name called from that platform. She knew only that tomorrow he would call upon her, and that whatever answer she gave him would decide far more than a single season of chaperoned company. The carriage rattled over cobblestones, and Elinor stared out the window at the darkened city sliding past, her reflection ghostly and pale in the glass. Somewhere behind that reflection, she could still feel the weight of the Duke's gaze, steady and unblinking, as though he had been searching her face for something only he could see. She did not understand it yet, but she intended to find out. Morning arrived too quickly for Elinor's liking. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the ballroom over and over until the candle beside her bed burned down to nothing. When she finally rose, her aunt was already downstairs, pacing the small parlor with a stack of unopened letters clutched to her chest. "They have come already," Mrs. Whitfield said, thrusting the letters toward her niece the moment she appeared in the doorway. "Invitations, 5 of them delivered before breakfast. Do you understand what this means, Elinor? Yesterday you were invisible to these people. Today they cannot write to you fast enough." Elinor took the letters with trembling hands and studied the elegant script on each envelope. Names she recognized only from distant gossip, families whose townhouses she had walked past 100 times without ever imagining she might one day cross their thresholds. She broke the seal on the first, a card inviting her to a garden luncheon hosted by a countess she had never met, and felt a strange, hollow unease settle in her stomach. "They do not want me," she said quietly. "They want to see the woman the Duke chose. There is a difference, Aunt, and I fear it is one that will not serve me well." "Whatever their reasons, you cannot refuse," her aunt said, sinking into a chair with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent half the night calculating the social consequences of the evening before. "To decline now would only fuel the very gossip you wish to avoid. You must attend, and you must conduct yourself with perfect composure, no matter what unkind words you overhear." Elinor was still turning this over in her mind when the knock came at the front door, sharp and confident, exactly on time. She knew before the maid announced him that it could only be one caller. She smoothed the front of her plain morning dress, wishing suddenly that she owned something finer, then chastised herself for the thought. She was not going to dress herself up for a man whose motives remained a complete mystery to her. The Duke entered the small parlor and seemed, for a moment, almost too large for the room, his presence filling every corner of the modest space in a way that made the furniture look shabbier than usual. He bowed to Mrs. Whitfield first, with perfect courtesy, before turning his attention to Elinor. "Miss Ashworth, I trust you slept well." "I trust you know that I did not," Elinor replied, and caught the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth that might, on a less guarded man, have been the beginning of a smile. Mrs. Whitfield, sensing the need for propriety, remained seated near the window with her needlework, close enough to serve as chaperone but far enough to allow a measure of private conversation. The Duke took the chair across from Alina, folding his hands with the same deliberate calm he had shown the night before. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "I imagine I have more questions than you have patience to answer," Alina replied. "But I will begin with the simplest one. Why me? There were a dozen women in that room far better suited to your attention, women with fortunes and titles and every advantage I lack. I would like an honest answer, Your Grace, not a polished one." He was quiet for a long moment, and Alina watched something shift behind his eyes, a flicker of memory or grief that he seemed determined to keep locked away. "The honest answer is one I am not yet prepared to give in full. I know that is not the response you wish to hear, and I do not blame you for your frustration. But I will tell you this much. My reasons have nothing to do with mockery, and nothing to do with your fortune or the lack of it. They concern a promise I made long ago, to someone who is no longer able to release me from it." Alina studied him carefully. There was no performance in his words, no theatrical flourish designed to win her sympathy. If anything, he seemed reluctant to have said even that much. "A promise to whom?" "That is a matter for another day," he said, and the shutters came down again behind his eyes, the brief window of vulnerability closing as quickly as it had opened. "For now, I ask only that you consider the arrangement I proposed last night. You will be under no obligation beyond attending certain events with me this season, under your aunt's proper supervision at all times. You will find that my household is generous, and that any hardship your family currently faces will be considerably eased." "You make it sound like a business transaction," Alina said. "In many ways it is," he admitted. "I will not insult you by pretending otherwise, but I would ask that you also consider it an opportunity, one that few women in your position are ever given." Alina rose and walked to the window, staring out at the narrow street below, where a coal cart rattled past, and a pair of children chased a hoop along the cobblestones. She thought of her father, gone now for nearly a year, and the debts he had left behind despite a lifetime of quiet, careful living. She thought of her aunt's worried face each time a bill arrived, and the small, private fear that had followed Alina through every day since the funeral, the fear of what would become of them both if their modest savings ran out entirely. "I will agree," she said finally, turning back to face him, "but I have conditions of my own, Your Grace." Something flickered across his face again, surprise perhaps, or something closer to respect. "I am listening. I will not be paraded before society as a curiosity, to be laughed at behind fans and gossiped about at every turn. If I am to endure the whispers that will surely follow this arrangement, I expect you to treat me with the same courtesy you would show any lady of your own rank. I will not be made a fool, even in service of whatever promise binds you." "You have my word," he said, and something in the steadiness of his voice made her believe him, despite every instinct that told her caution was still the wiser path. "And second," Alina continued, "I expect honesty between us, even when the truth is inconvenient. I would rather hear an unpleasant fact from your own lips than discover it later through gossip and speculation." The Duke considered this for a long moment before nodding. "Agreed, though I will ask the same courtesy of you in return." "Then we have an understanding," Alina said, extending her hand in a gesture more suited to a business agreement than a courtship, which was, she reminded herself, precisely what this was meant to be. He took her hand, and the brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her fingers, one she quickly attributed to nerves and nothing more. "I will send a carriage for you and your aunt on Thursday evening. There is a musical performance at Lady Pemberton's townhouse. It will be your first proper introduction to society as my acquaintance, and I suspect it will not be an easy evening." "I did not expect it to be," Alina said. The days that followed passed in a strange, disorienting blur. A dressmaker arrived at their modest home 2 days later, sent by the Duke himself, with bolts of fine fabric that made Alina's aunt gasp aloud. Alina protested at first, insisting she did not require new gowns to fulfill their arrangement, but the dressmaker, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Hollies, informed her plainly that appearing in society dressed as she had been would only invite further ridicule, and that the Duke had insisted on covering the expense as part of their agreement, not as a gift, but as a practical necessity. Alina stood for hours as measurements were taken, and fabrics were pinned, feeling increasingly like a doll being dressed for someone else's amusement rather than a woman making her own choices. Yet there was something undeniably transforming about watching herself in the looking glass as the first finished gown was fitted, a deep blue silk that brought out color in her cheeks she had never noticed before. "You look lovely, my dear," her aunt said softly, and for the first time since the auction, Alina allowed herself a small, cautious hope that perhaps this strange arrangement might bring something good after all. That hope was tested severely on Thursday evening, when their carriage arrived at Lady Pemberton's grand townhouse, and Alina stepped into a drawing room glittering with candlelight and diamonds. Conversations halted the moment she entered on the Duke's arm. Fans rose to cover whispering mouths. She caught fragments of comments not meant for her ears, cruel speculation about her family, her modest background, the scandal of a duke lowering himself to notice a woman of no consequence. She kept her chin high and her expression composed, exactly as she had promised herself she would, even as her heart hammered painfully beneath her new silk gown. The Duke remained at her side throughout the evening, introducing her to acquaintances with a formal courtesy that offered no room for insult, though she could see in the eyes of several guests that courtesy alone would not be enough to silence the gossip entirely. It was during a brief pause in the musical performance that Alina first noticed the woman in emerald silk from the auction night watching her again, this time from across the drawing room, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp as knives. A companion beside Alina leaned close and murmured the woman's name with obvious relish, clearly hoping to stir some reaction. "That is Lady Charlotte Vane," the woman said. "Everyone assumed she and the Duke would announce their engagement this very season. I imagine she is not pleased with how matters have unfolded." Alina glanced toward the striking woman once more, and found Lady Charlotte's gaze locked directly on her own, cold and assessing, the kind of look that promised trouble long before any words were exchanged. Alina forced herself to look away first, refusing to give the other woman the satisfaction of a reaction, though her stomach twisted with a new and unfamiliar dread. Later that evening, as the Duke escorted her back to her carriage, Alina could not help but ask the question that had been building in her mind since the moment she learned Lady Charlotte's name. "Was there truth to what I heard tonight, about you and Lady Vane?" The Duke's expression remained carefully neutral, though something tightened at the corner of his jaw. "There was an understanding between our families at one time, though nothing was ever formally settled. It is a matter of the past, and I would not have you concern yourself with it." "I am not concerned," Alina said, though the lie sat uneasily on her tongue. "I only wish to understand the full landscape of what I have agreed to. If Lady Vane believes herself wronged by our arrangement, I suspect she will not remain silent about it." "No," the Duke agreed quietly, helping her into the carriage with careful courtesy. "I do not expect she will." As the carriage pulled away from the glittering townhouse and into the darkened streets, Alina found herself replaying the entire evening in her mind, the whispers, the stares, the strange warmth of the Duke's hand at her back as he guided her through the crowded room, and above all, the cold, calculating look in Lady Charlotte Vane's eyes. She did not yet know how deeply that look would come to shape the difficult months ahead, but some instinct, sharper than reason, told her that the true trial of this arrangement had only just begun. The scandal sheets found her within a week. Alina first learned of it when her aunt set down a folded newspaper at the breakfast table without a word, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. Alina unfolded the paper and found, printed in bold letters near the top of the society column, a paragraph dedicated entirely to speculation about her family, her modest upbringing, and the mystery of why a Duke of Sebastian's standing would choose a woman so far beneath him. The writer had not used her name outright, referring to her only as the vicar's daughter from the auction, but there was no mistaking who they meant. "They have made me a joke," Alina said quietly, setting the paper down with hands that had begun to tremble despite her best efforts to remain composed. An amusement for people who have never even spoken a word to me. You must not let it wound you, her aunt said, though her own voice wavered with worry. These things pass. London finds a new scandal every fortnight. But the days that followed proved her aunt's comfort only partly true. Elinor found herself the subject of pointed stares at every gathering she attended, the target of whispered comments that grew bolder each time the Duke stepped away, even briefly, to greet an acquaintance. At a garden party hosted by a marchioness whose name Elinor could barely remember, she overheard two women discussing her in low, cutting tones near a hedge of roses, unaware or uncaring that she stood close enough to hear every word. They say her father left nothing but debts, one woman murmured. It is no wonder she leapt at the chance the moment the Duke raised his hand. What else could a girl like that hope for? I heard she practically threw herself in his path, the other replied. These country girls know exactly how to play the innocent when it suits them. Elinor felt heat rush to her face, a mixture of humiliation and fury she had rarely experienced in her quiet, sheltered life. She wanted desperately to turn and correct them, to explain that she had never sought the Duke's attention, that she had stood on that platform expecting nothing at all. But she knew, with the bitter clarity of experience gained over the past week, that any response from her would only be twisted into further gossip. She walked away instead, her spine straight, her expression carefully blank, though her hands shook at her sides the entire way back to the refreshment table. It was there that the Duke found her a short while later, his sharp gaze taking in her tight expression before she could compose herself fully. Something has upset you, he said, not a question but a simple observation. Nothing of consequence, Elinor replied, reaching for a glass of lemonade she did not particularly want, if only to give her hands something to do. Elinor. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the unexpected intimacy of it caught her off guard enough that she looked up at him directly. You agreed to honesty between us. I would ask you to honor that agreement now. She hesitated only a moment before the words spilled out, quieter than she intended, edged with a frustration she had been holding in check for days. They believe I schemed for your attention. They believe I am a fortune hunter who tricked her way onto that platform in hopes of catching a Duke's eye. I have done nothing, Your Grace, nothing at all, and still I am painted as though I were the villain of some cheap novel. His expression darkened, though not, she noticed, with the cool detachment she had come to expect from him. This was something closer to genuine anger, controlled but unmistakable. You have my apologies. I did not fully consider how the gossip would fall so heavily upon you and so lightly upon me. That is an unfairness I intend to correct. How do you propose to correct the opinions of half of London? Elinor asked, unable to keep the weariness from her voice. By making my intentions unmistakable, he said simply. Come, there is someone I would like you to meet properly, someone whose good opinion carries considerable weight in circles that matter. He led her across the garden to where an elderly woman sat beneath a striped awning, dressed in dark, elegant silk, her sharp eyes missing nothing as they approached. Elinor recognized her immediately, though she had never been formally introduced. Lady Beaumont was one of the most respected and feared figures in all of society, a woman whose approval could silence a scandal as effectively as her disapproval could destroy a reputation entirely. Lady Beaumont, the Duke said, bowing with genuine warmth. Elinor had not seen him show anyone else. May I present Miss Elinor Ashworth? The old woman studied Elinor for a long, uncomfortable moment, her gaze traveling from the modest cut of her borrowed jewelry to the careful composure of her expression. So you are the young woman everyone cannot stop discussing, Lady Beaumont said finally, her voice dry as autumn leaves. Sit, child. I find I have grown tired of hearing second-hand accounts of you and would much prefer to form my own opinion. Elinor sat, glancing briefly at the Duke, who offered no reassurance beyond a small, steady nod before stepping away to allow the conversation to proceed without his presence. For the better part of an hour, Lady Beaumont questioned Elinor on every subject imaginable: her father's parish work, her views on charity, her favorite books, her opinions on the education of young women, each question probing and direct in a way that left no room for polished, meaningless answers. To Alina's surprise, she found herself relaxing as the conversation continued, speaking honestly about her father's belief that kindness mattered more than wealth, about the small charitable works she had helped organize in their parish, about her genuine love of reading and her frustration at having so little access to books since moving to London. Lady Beaumont listened with an intensity that suggested she was weighing every word carefully, though her expression gave little away. "You are not at all what the gossips have described," Lady Beaumont said finally, setting down her teacup with a decisive click. "They paint you as either a scheming fortune hunter or a pitiful charity case, and you are neither. You are, I think, a rather sensible young woman who has found herself in an extraordinary and uncomfortable situation through no fault of her own." "Thank you, my lady," Alina said, feeling a genuine wave of relief wash through her. "Do not thank me yet," the old woman said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. "My opinion alone will not silence every wagging tongue in Mayfair. But I will say this much where others can hear it, and that may be enough to shift the tide in your favor, at least a little." True to her word, by the following week, the tone of the gossip had begun to shift, subtly but unmistakably. Lady Beaumont's public approval of Alina at the garden party had been noted and repeated throughout the drawing rooms of London, and where before Alina had been dismissed as either scheming or pathetic, she now found herself regarded, at least by some, with cautious curiosity rather than open scorn. Yet not everyone was so easily swayed. Lady Charlotte Vane remained a constant, watchful presence at nearly every event Alina attended with the Duke, her cool smile never quite reaching her eyes, her comments always polished and polite on the surface while carrying an unmistakable edge beneath. At a dinner party hosted by one of the Duke's distant cousins, Charlotte seated herself directly across from Alina and spent the better part of the meal asking pointed questions about Alina's family history, her father's finances, and the precise nature of her arrangement with the Duke, each question delivered with a sweetness that did nothing to soften the cruelty of its intent. "It must be quite an adjustment," Charlotte said at one point, her voice carrying just enough for the surrounding guests to hear, "moving from such humble circumstances into a world so far beyond anything you have known. I do wonder how you manage it all without stumbling." "I manage well enough," Alina replied evenly, refusing to let the barb land as visibly as Charlotte clearly hoped it would. "Though I imagine it must be far more difficult to watch circumstances change so suddenly when one has grown accustomed to expecting a particular outcome." A flicker of surprise crossed Charlotte's face at the quiet steel in Alina's response, quickly masked by another polished smile. "How clever you are, Miss Ashworth. I had not expected such wit from a vicar's daughter." "There is a great deal about me you have not expected, Lady Vane," Alina said, holding the other woman's gaze steadily. "I suspect you will continue to be surprised." Across the table, Alina caught the Duke watching the exchange with an expression she could not quite read, something between amusement and quiet pride, though he said nothing to intervene. Later, as their carriage rolled through the quiet streets toward home, he broke the silence that had settled comfortably between them. "You handled Lady Vane admirably tonight," he said, "better than most would have managed." "She does not frighten me," Alina said, though this was not entirely true. "She wishes me to believe I do not belong in her world, and perhaps she is right. But I refuse to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble beneath the weight of her disapproval." "Good," he said simply, and something in the quiet approval of that single word warmed her far more than she expected it to. The following weeks brought a strange new rhythm to Alina's life. She attended musical evenings and dinner parties, garden luncheons and afternoon calls, always at the Duke's side, always under the watchful, calculating eyes of society. She learned to navigate the subtle cruelties of the ton with increasing skill, deflecting pointed questions with quiet wit, meeting cold stares with steady composure. And slowly, almost without noticing it happening, she began to look forward to the moments she spent in the Duke's company, the brief conversations shared in quiet corners of crowded rooms, the rare, unguarded smiles that occasionally broke through his careful reserve. She still did not know the full truth of why he had chosen her that night at the auction. The promise he had mentioned remained unexplained, a shadow hanging over every interaction between them, a mystery she found herself increasingly desperate to solve. But beneath the uncertainty, something else had begun to grow, quiet and unexpected, something that felt dangerously close to genuine affection. Alina was not certain whether to welcome this feeling or fear it, given how little she still understood about the man who had upended her entire world with a single raised hand in a crowded ballroom. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in a moment so small that Alina almost did not think of it as significant at all until much later. She had accompanied the Duke to a charity visit at a home for orphaned children on the edge of the city, part of the very fund the auction had originally been meant to support. The Duke had suggested the outing almost reluctantly, mentioning only that he preferred to see firsthand where the money from such events actually went, rather than trusting the reports of distant committees. The home was a modest brick building, clean but sparsely furnished, filled with children of all ages who watched the arrival of a Duke's carriage with wide, curious eyes. Alina had expected the visit to be brief and formal, a quick tour followed by polite conversation with the matron in charge. Instead, she found herself drawn almost immediately toward a small group of younger children gathered near a cold hearth, several of them shivering despite the mild afternoon. Without thinking, without waiting for permission or considering how it might appear, Alina knelt down among them, asking their names, listening to their stories with the same patient attention her father had once shown to every member of his parish, no matter how humble. She noticed one small girl, no older than 5, sitting apart from the others, her thin dress clearly too light for the drafty room. Alina removed her own shawl without hesitation and wrapped it gently around the child's shoulders, earning a small, shy smile that seemed to light the entire room. She did not notice the Duke watching from the doorway until much later, when the matron mentioned, in an offhand remark, how unusual it was to see a lady of quality kneel on a cold stone floor without a moment's concern for her fine gown. Alina had laughed it off, insisting that a little dust never harmed anyone, but the comment lingered in her mind long after they departed. It was not until their carriage was well on its way back toward the city that the Duke finally spoke of it. "You did not have to give the child your shawl," he said quietly. "She was cold," Alina replied, as though the answer were the simplest thing in the world. "I had another at home." Most ladies of my acquaintance would have offered sympathy from a safe distance, and perhaps a coin pressed into a matron's palm on their way out the door. Few would think to kneel on stone floors or part with their own clothing for a child they had known less than an hour. Alina glanced at him, uncertain how to respond to the strange intensity in his tone. "My father always said that kindness given from a distance is barely kindness at all. He believed that if you could not bring yourself to sit beside someone in their trouble, you had no right to claim you cared for their welfare." Something shifted in the Duke's expression then, a softening so subtle she might have missed it had she not been watching him so closely. "Your father sounds as though he was a remarkable man." "He was," Alina said softly. "I miss him every day." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring out the carriage window at the passing streets, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. "I lost someone as well. Someone whose absence I still feel more sharply than I care to admit, even now." Alina waited, sensing the fragility of the moment, unwilling to press him further than he seemed willing to go on his own. After a long silence he continued, his words careful and measured, as though each one cost him something to release. "My younger brother, Edmund. He died 4 years ago, in a fire that swept through a mill he had gone to inspect on our family's behalf. I was not there. I was in London, attending to business I have long since forgotten the details of, business that seemed important at the time and means nothing to me now. By the time word reached me, it was already too late." "I am so sorry," Alina said softly, the words feeling inadequate against the depth of grief she could hear beneath his carefully controlled tone. "He was kind in a way I never managed to be," the Duke continued, almost as though speaking to himself now rather than to her. "Warmer, more generous. He would have knelt on that stone floor without a second thought, just as you did today. I have spent 4 years trying in small ways to live up to the example he set, and I have mostly failed." Alina reached out, without fully deciding to do so, and rested her hand gently over his where it lay clenched on his knee. "I do not think you have failed as thoroughly as you believe, Your Grace." He looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes, and for a long moment something passed between them that neither of them seemed prepared to name. He did not pull away, and neither did she, and the carriage rattled on through the streets of London carrying a silence that felt, for the first time since the night of the auction, entirely comfortable. From that day forward, something between them began to change, gradually but unmistakably. The Duke began finding reasons to call upon Alina and her aunt beyond the strict requirements of their arrangement, arriving with books he thought she might enjoy, or news of a lecture he believed would interest her, or simply the excuse of accompanying her on a walk through the park, while her aunt trailed a discreet distance behind. Alina found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that frightened her slightly, given how carefully she had guarded her heart since her father's passing. One afternoon, as they walked together along a quiet path lined with blooming hedges, the Duke asked her, almost hesitantly, about her own hopes for the future, questions no one had thought to ask her in years. "What did you imagine for yourself before all of this happened?" he asked. "Before the auction, before any of it." Alina considered the question carefully before answering. "I imagined a quiet life, much like the one my father lived. Perhaps I would have married a modest clergyman or a farmer with good land, and spent my days managing a household and helping those in our parish who had less than we did. I never imagined anything grand. I am not certain I know how to want grand things." "And now," he asked, "now that you have been thrust into a world far grander than anything you imagined, what do you want?" Alina considered her answer for a long moment, watching the afternoon light filter through the leaves above them. "I want honesty," she said finally. "I want to be valued for who I am, not for what I represent to society, or to any promise made years ago that I know nothing about. I want, I suppose, to matter to someone, truly matter, beyond obligation or duty." The Duke stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes intense in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. "You matter to me, Alina, far more than I anticipated when this arrangement began." "Do I?" she asked, unable to keep the vulnerability from her voice. "Or do I matter because of whatever promise binds you to me? I still do not know the truth of it, and I find myself increasingly desperate to understand." He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might finally tell her everything, might finally lift the veil of mystery that had hung over their arrangement since the very beginning. But something held him back, some old caution or fear she could not name, and the moment passed before he could find the words. "Soon," he said instead. "I promise you soon you will know everything. I only ask for a little more patience." Alina nodded, though disappointment settled heavily in her chest. She had begun to trust him, more than she had ever expected to trust a man she had known for such a short time, and yet the unanswered questions between them remained a persistent shadow over whatever was growing in her heart. She did not know, as they continued their walk in a silence weighted with unspoken things, that the answers he withheld would soon be forced into the open, not by his own choosing, but by the schemes of a woman determined to see their arrangement destroyed before it could become anything more. Lady Charlotte Vane had not risen to her position in society by accepting defeat gracefully, and she had no intention of beginning now. For weeks, she had watched the growing closeness between the Duke and Alina Ashworth with a carefully controlled fury that simmered beneath her polished exterior, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had spent years cultivating an understanding with Sebastian Wolversley, an understanding she had believed, until the night of that wretched auction, was as good as settled. She did not intend to lose everything she had worked toward to a plain, penniless vicar's daughter with nothing but a father's good name, and a stubborn sort of dignity. She began her campaign quietly, calling upon acquaintances in circles far removed from the fashionable drawing rooms of Mayfair, seeking information rather than gossip. She hired a discreet inquiry agent, a man skilled in uncovering the sort of details families preferred to keep buried, and set him to work investigating every corner of Eleanor Ashworth's past. The results took nearly a fortnight to arrive, delivered to Charlotte's private sitting room in a plain folder that she opened with trembling, eager hands. Most of what the agent had uncovered was unremarkable, exactly the sort of quiet, unimportant life she had expected from a country vicar's daughter. But buried within the pages was a single detail that made Charlotte's breath catch with vicious satisfaction. Eleanor's father, the late Reverend Ashworth, had once served as vicar in a small parish near the estate belonging to the Duke's family, decades earlier, long before Eleanor's birth. And more significantly, the agent's report indicated that the Reverend Ashworth had been present, and had played some role, in an incident involving the Duke's family that had never been publicly discussed, an incident connected somehow to the fire that had claimed the life of the Duke's younger brother. Charlotte did not have the full story, only fragments and rumors gathered from servants long dismissed and villagers with fading memories. But it was enough. Enough to suggest that Eleanor's presence in the Duke's life was no accident of fate, no romantic whim born from a chance encounter at an auction, but something calculated and deliberate, tied to old debts and older grief. If she could reveal this connection publicly, before Eleanor had the chance to explain it herself, she could paint the entire arrangement as manipulative, or worse, as evidence that the Duke's affections, whatever they might be, were built on obligation rather than genuine feeling. She began spreading careful, deniable whispers among her closest confidants, planting seeds of doubt with the skill of a woman who had spent years learning exactly how society's rumor mill operated. She suggested, in tones of feigned concern, that there was more to Miss Ashworth's sudden rise than anyone realized, that perhaps the girl's family had some old connection to the Wolversley estate that explained everything far better than mere chance. The whispers reached Eleanor gradually, in the form of pointed questions from acquaintances she barely knew, questions about her father's early career, about parishes she had never heard him mention, about connections to the Duke's family that predated her own birth by decades. At first, Eleanor dismissed the questions as simply another form of the constant scrutiny she had endured since the auction. But as the questions grew more specific, more insistent, a cold unease began to settle in her chest. She raised the matter with her aunt one evening, after a particularly uncomfortable dinner party where no fewer than 3 separate guests had asked pointed questions about her father's early ministry. "Aunt, did father ever serve near the Wolversley estate?" "Before I was born, perhaps." Mrs. Whitfield's face went pale, and she set down her needlework with hands that trembled slightly. "Why do you ask such a question, Eleanor?" "Because people keep asking me about it, and I have no answer to give them. If there is something I do not know, I would rather hear it from you than continue stumbling through these conversations blind." Her aunt was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as though searching for the right words among the flames. "Your father did serve in a parish near the Wolversley lands many years ago before he married your mother. It was a difficult time for him, one he rarely spoke of, even to me. I know only fragments of what happened there." "What kind of fragments?" Eleanor pressed. "There was an incident, a fire, I believe, at a mill on the estate. Your father was involved somehow in the aftermath, though I never learned the full details. He left that parish not long after, and the family he served never spoke of it again, at least not that I ever heard. It was long before the current Duke's time, Eleanor, when Sebastian Wolversley's own father held the title." Eleanor sat back, her mind racing to make sense of this new information. A fire at a mill, connected somehow to her father, decades before the fire that had claimed the Duke's brother's life. It seemed too great a coincidence to ignore, and yet she could not begin to guess how the pieces fit together. She resolved to ask the Duke directly the next time she saw him, but circumstances conspired against her. Lady Charlotte's whispers had grown louder and bolder in the days since, And by the time Alina next encountered the Duke, at a ball hosted by one of his own distant relations, the gossip had already spread far beyond anything Charlotte could have controlled even if she had wished to. The ball itself felt different from the moment Alina arrived, the air thick with a tension she could not quite name. Conversations halted more abruptly than usual when she passed, and the stares that followed her felt sharper, more knowing, than the ordinary curiosity she had grown accustomed to enduring. She caught sight of Lady Charlotte across the room, resplendent in deep crimson silk, watching her with an expression of barely concealed triumph. It was during a lull in the dancing that Alina overheard the conversation that would change everything. She had stepped away from the crowded ballroom floor to catch her breath near an open terrace door, seeking a moment of quiet away from the watchful eyes that seemed to track her every movement. Two women stood just beyond the door, their voices carrying clearly on the cool night air, unaware of her presence in the shadows nearby. "They say her father was the one who started the fire," one voice said, low and scandalized. "That he was meant to be watching the mill that night and fell asleep at his post. And the young Wolversley brother died trying to fight the flames alone, because no one raised the alarm in time." Alina's blood ran cold, her hand flying to cover her mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. "That cannot be true," the second voice replied. "Surely the Duke would never have chosen her if her own father bore some responsibility for his brother's death." "That is precisely why he chose her," the first voice insisted. "I heard it from someone close to Lady Vane herself. The old Reverend Ashworth begged the Wolversley family's forgiveness on his deathbed, and the current Duke made some manner of promise to his dying brother to look after the Ashworth family out of guilt, or honor, or some tangled mixture of both. It has nothing to do with genuine affection at all. It is nothing but an old debt being repaid." Alina did not wait to hear more. She turned and fled back into the crowded ballroom, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might be visible through the fabric of her gown. She searched desperately for the Duke, needing to hear the truth from his own lips, needing to know whether the whispered accusation carried any grain of truth, or whether it was simply another cruel fabrication designed to wound her. She found him near the refreshment table, deep in conversation with an elderly gentleman she did not recognize. The moment he saw her face, his expression shifted immediately to concern. "Alina, what has happened?" "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice barely steady. "Now, if you please." He excused himself immediately and followed her to a quieter corner of the room, away from the densest crowds, though Alina was uncomfortably aware that eyes still followed them, watching, waiting for whatever drama was about to unfold. "Tell me the truth," Alina said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I have just overheard the most terrible accusation, that my father was somehow responsible for your brother's death, that the fire at the mill that killed him was my father's fault, and that you chose me at that auction not out of any genuine interest, but out of guilt, or obligation, or some debt of honor tied to his dying wish. Is any part of this true?" The Duke's face went pale, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something close to genuine fear flicker across his controlled features. "Alina, it is not so simple as the gossips would have you believe." "Then tell me the truth," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. "Please. I cannot bear this uncertainty any longer." He glanced around at the crowded room, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of explaining something so painful and personal in such a public setting, but he seemed to understand, finally, that he had delayed too long already. "Not here," he said quietly. "Come with me. I will tell you everything, I promise you, but not here, surrounded by people who care nothing for either of us beyond the entertainment our pain provides them." He led her toward a private study just off the main hallway, away from the noise and the watching eyes, and closed the door behind them with a quiet click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Alina stood facing him, her hands clenched at her sides, bracing herself for whatever truth he was finally prepared to share. "The fire that killed Edmund," he began, his voice low and careful, "was not caused by your father. That much of the rumor is entirely false, a twisted fabrication designed to wound you. But there is a connection between your family and mine that I have kept from you, and I understand now that my silence has done far more harm than the truth ever could have." Alina waited, her heart still pounding, as he drew a steadying breath and finally began to explain. "Your father was not to blame for the fire," the Duke said, choosing each word with evident care. "Quite the opposite, in fact. He was one of the bravest men I have ever heard described, though I never had the chance to meet him myself before his passing." Alina's breath caught in her throat. "Please tell me everything. I have waited long enough." The Duke gestured toward a pair of chairs near the cold hearth, and they sat facing one another, the study quiet except for the distant, muffled sound of music from the ballroom beyond the closed door. "Your father served as vicar in the parish near our estate for several years before your birth. During that time, he became close friends with my brother Edmund, who was still quite young then, perhaps 16 or 17. Edmund often spoke of a vicar who treated him not as the son of a duke, but simply as a young man worth knowing, someone who challenged him to think more deeply about the world and his place in it. That vicar was your father." Alina pressed a hand to her chest, trying to absorb this unexpected connection to a man she had never known her father had befriended. "I never knew any of this. He rarely spoke of his early years in the ministry. There is a reason for that, I believe, though I did not fully understand it myself until recently." The Duke's expression grew heavier, the careful composure he usually maintained slipping to reveal genuine grief beneath. "4 years ago, when the fire broke out at the mill, your father happened to be visiting the estate, though he had left that parish years earlier for the one where you were raised. He and Edmund had remained close despite the distance, and your father had come to discuss some matter of charity work they had long collaborated on together." "He was there," Alina whispered, the pieces beginning to align in her mind with terrible clarity. "He was there when the fire started." "He was," the Duke confirmed quietly. "By every account I have gathered since, from witnesses who survived that night, your father ran into the burning building alongside Edmund without a moment's hesitation, helping to pull 3 mill workers to safety before the flames grew too fierce to withstand. He suffered severe burns and injury to his lungs from the smoke, injuries the physicians of the time believed he might not survive at all." Alina felt tears gathering, hot and sudden, as she began to understand the shape of the truth the Duke had kept from her. "And Edmund?" The Duke's jaw tightened, grief flickering plainly across his face now, unguarded for perhaps the first time since she had known him. "My brother went back in, a final time, believing there was still someone trapped inside. Your father tried to stop him, tried to go with him, but his injuries were already too severe to allow it. Edmund did not come out again." The study fell silent except for the soft sound of Alina's quiet weeping, grief for a man she had never met, whose kindness had shaped her father's final years in ways she had never understood until this very moment. The Duke reached out, hesitant at first, then rested his hand gently over hers, offering what comfort he could. "Your father survived that night, though barely," he continued after a long moment. "He returned home to his new parish weakened, his lungs damaged beyond full recovery. I believe now that those injuries, though he lived nearly 2 more years, ultimately shortened his life considerably. He never spoke publicly of his role in the fire, and I suspect he carried the weight of surviving when Edmund did not for the rest of his days." "Why did he never tell me?" Alina asked softly. "Why keep such a thing hidden?" "I cannot answer that with certainty," the Duke said gently. "Perhaps he did not wish you to carry the burden of his grief alongside your own. Perhaps he believed silence was its own form of mercy, both toward himself and toward you. Men carry their sorrows in strange and private ways, Alina. I have learned that lesson well enough in my own life." Alina wiped at her eyes, struggling to compose herself even as new questions crowded her mind. "And the promise you mentioned, the one that bound you to bid on me that night. What was it?" The Duke drew a slow breath before answering, as though the words themselves carried weight he had long avoided setting down. "Before Edmund died, in the brief moments after he was pulled from the ruins of that building, barely conscious and fading fast, he made me promise something. He told me of the vicar's daughter he had heard so much about through your father's letters over the years, a girl he had never met but felt he knew regardless, through every story your father shared of your kindness, your intelligence, your quiet strength. He made me swear that if fate ever brought that girl into difficulty, I would see to her welfare, whatever the cost. I did not fully understand what he meant at the time. I was too consumed by grief to think clearly about anything beyond the loss standing directly in front of me. "And when did you understand?" Elinor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When your father passed, nearly a year ago, I received word through parish contacts my family has long maintained in that region. I learned of your circumstances, the debts left behind, the uncertain future you and your aunt faced. I intended to help quietly, through discreet charitable means, without ever revealing myself or the promise that motivated my actions. But circumstances conspired otherwise, and when I saw your name listed among the young women participating in that charity auction, I recognized it immediately. I could not simply stand aside and watch you paraded before a room of strangers, as though you were nothing more than a commodity to be purchased. I acted before I had fully considered the consequences of doing so, and I fear that impulsive decision has caused you far more harm than the quiet assistance I originally intended." Elinor sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full weight of everything he had shared, the tragic connection between their families, the dying wish of a young man she had never known, the guilt and grief the Duke had carried alone for 4 long years. "You bid on me that night out of obligation to a promise made to a dying brother," she said slowly, testing the shape of the words as she spoke them. "Not out of any genuine regard for me at all." "That is not entirely true," the Duke said quickly, leaning forward with sudden urgency. "The promise brought me to that ballroom that night, yes. It is what drove my initial bid before I had even properly looked at you, before I understood anything of who you truly were beyond your name and your family's connection to my own. But everything since then, every conversation we have shared, every moment I have spent in your company, has had nothing whatsoever to do with obligation. I did not expect to find myself drawn to you as I have been, Elinor. I did not anticipate the depth of feeling that has grown between us these past weeks. That is entirely, and only, my own doing, born of who you are, not who your father once was to my brother." Elinor searched his face for any sign of falsehood and found none, only the same steady sincerity that had unsettled and intrigued her from the very first night they met. And yet, despite his careful explanation, a painful doubt lingered at the edges of her heart, a fear she could not fully silence no matter how earnestly he spoke. "I need time," she said finally, rising from her chair on legs that felt unsteady beneath her. "This is a great deal to absorb all at once, and I find I cannot trust my own judgment tonight, not with my emotions in such disarray." "Of course," the Duke said, rising as well, though clear disappointment shadowed his features. "Take whatever time you require. I will not press you for an answer you are not ready to give." Elinor left the study and made her way back through the crowded ballroom in something of a daze, barely registering the curious glances that followed her passage. She found her aunt near the edge of the dance floor, and insisted, with quiet urgency, that they depart immediately, offering no explanation beyond a headache that felt only slightly less true than the turmoil actually churning within her. As their carriage rattled through the darkened streets toward home, Elinor stared out the window without truly seeing the passing city, her mind consumed entirely by the revelation of the evening. She did not know in that moment that Lady Charlotte Vane's carefully constructed rumor, though based on a distorted and cruel version of the truth, had already accomplished exactly what its architect intended. It had forced the Duke's secret into the open before he was fully ready to share it, and it had planted a seed of doubt in Elinor's heart that would prove far more difficult to uproot than either of them yet understood. In the days that followed, Elinor found herself retreating from the world in a way she had not done even in the darkest weeks after her father's passing. She declined 2 invitations that arrived from the Duke's household, citing a lingering headache that had, by now, become something closer to true than she cared to admit. Her aunt watched her with growing concern, though she said little, sensing that her niece needed space to work through whatever turmoil occupied her thoughts. Elinor spent long hours turning the Duke's revelation over in her mind, examining it from every possible angle. She believed him when he said the fire had not been her father's fault, and something in her heart eased slightly at finally understanding the quiet sorrow that had shadowed her father's final years, a sorrow she had always sensed but never understood. She found a strange comfort, even amid the grief, in learning that her father had died a hero in every sense that mattered, that his final years of declining health had been the cost of saving 3 lives rather than any failing of his own. But the matter of the promise, and what it meant for her own relationship with the Duke, proved far harder to settle in her mind. She wanted desperately to believe that his feelings for her had grown independent of any obligation to a dying brother's wish, and in her most honest moments, she did believe it, remembering the countless small kindnesses he had shown her, the vulnerability he had revealed in sharing his own grief, the warmth in his eyes that seemed too genuine to be mere performance of duty. And yet doubt crept in during her quieter, lonelier hours, whispering that perhaps she could never fully separate his affection from the guilt and obligation that had first brought them together, that perhaps she would spend the rest of her life wondering whether he loved her for herself, or simply because a promise demanded it of him. Lady Charlotte Vane, meanwhile, had no intention of allowing the matter to rest, however much truth had finally emerged to complicate her carefully constructed narrative. Though the full and accurate story had begun to circulate, correcting the cruel suggestion that Elinor's father bore any blame for Edmund's death, Charlotte found new angles to exploit in the aftermath. She called upon acquaintances with fresh whispers, suggesting now that the entire arrangement between Elinor and the Duke was nothing more than an elaborate act of charity dressed up as courtship, that no man of Sebastian's standing could possibly harbor genuine affection for a woman connected so intimately to his brother's death, however heroic her father's actions had ultimately proven to be. "It is rather sad if you consider it," Charlotte remarked to a small gathering of her closest confidants over afternoon tea, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The poor girl believes herself loved, when in truth she is simply the living reminder of the Duke's failure to save his own brother. I imagine every moment he spends with her must be a torment of guilt rather than genuine affection. How exhausting that must be for him, to smile through such pain." These whispers found their way to Elinor within days, delivered by well-meaning acquaintances who felt she deserved to know what was being said, though the knowledge did nothing but deepen the doubt already gnawing at her heart. She began to notice, or perhaps to imagine, a certain heaviness in the Duke's expression whenever their eyes met across a crowded room, and she could no longer tell whether it stemmed from genuine sorrow at her continued distance, or from the guilt Charlotte had so cruelly suggested lay beneath every kindness he had shown her. The Duke, for his part, grew increasingly desperate as the days passed without word from Elinor beyond brief, formal notes declining his invitations. He was a man unaccustomed to being refused anything, and even more unaccustomed to the particular helplessness of caring deeply for someone who seemed determined to keep him at arm's length. He called upon her townhouse twice more, only to be informed by the housekeeper, with evident discomfort, that Miss Ashworth was not receiving visitors. On the third occasion, he did not simply leave his card and depart as propriety demanded. He waited in the small front parlor, refusing to be turned away, until Elinor herself finally appeared in the doorway, drawn as much by curiosity as by the impossibility of continuing to avoid him within her own home. "You cannot keep refusing to see me," he said, the moment she entered the room, his usual composure fraying at the edges in a way she had never witnessed before. "I understand you require time, and I have tried to respect that. But this silence is unbearable, Elinor. I would rather face your anger directly than endure another week of these formal, empty notes." "What would you have me say?" Elinor asked, her voice tighter than she intended. "That I have decided to trust you completely, despite everything I have learned. That I no longer wonder in my quietest moments whether your affection for me is genuine or simply the fulfillment of a dying man's request. I wish I could offer you such certainty, your grace, but I find I cannot lie to you, even to ease your discomfort. Then do not lie, he said, taking a step closer, his gray eyes intense with an urgency that made her breath catch despite her resolve to remain guarded. Tell me honestly what troubles you most, and let me answer it directly, rather than allowing Lady Vane's poisonous whispers to answer it for you. Alina hesitated, torn between the caution that had protected her heart for so long and the desperate need to finally speak the fear that had haunted her every waking hour since that night in the study. I fear, she said slowly, that you cannot see me clearly at all. That every time you look at me, you see instead the shadow of your brother's dying wish, and the guilt of a promise you feel bound to honor. I fear that what feels like love to you is simply obligation wearing love's disguise, and that one day, perhaps not soon, but eventually, you will look at me and see nothing but duty where affection once seemed to be. The Duke was silent for a long moment, and Alina braced herself for reassurances she feared she would not fully believe. Instead, he surprised her by asking a question of his own. Do you love me, Alina? The directness of the question stole the breath from her lungs entirely. That is not the question at hand. It is precisely the question at hand, he insisted gently. Because if you do not love me, then my feelings, whatever their origin, matter little in the end, and we should part now cleanly, before either of us grows more attached than we already are. But if you do love me, and I believe, from everything I have observed these past weeks, that you do, then I would ask you to trust that same instinct when it tells you my feelings for you are equally genuine. Love does not announce itself with certificates of pure motive, Alina. It grows from whatever soil it is planted in, however tangled and complicated that soil might be. Mine began in grief and obligation, yes, but it did not remain there. It grew into something entirely its own, something that has nothing left to do with Edmund's promise and everything to do with you, exactly as you are. Alina felt tears gathering once more, though these carried a different weight than her earlier grief, something closer to the painful, hopeful ache of a heart finally allowing itself to believe. I am frightened, she admitted softly. I am frightened of loving you completely, only to discover someday that Charlotte was right, that I am nothing more than a reminder of your failure to save your brother. You are not a reminder of failure, he said fiercely, closing the remaining distance between them. You are the reason I have begun, for the first time in 4 years, to imagine a future that holds something more than duty and grief. If that is not love, Alina, then I do not know what word could possibly describe it. Before Alina could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the front door, followed almost immediately by the sound of raised voices in the entryway. Her aunt's startled exclamation carried clearly into the parlor, and moments later, the door burst open to reveal Lady Charlotte Vane herself, her face flushed with an anger she no longer bothered to conceal beneath polished composure. I thought I might find you here, Charlotte said, her voice sharp and brittle, directed at the Duke though her gaze cut toward Alina with unmistakable venom. I have come to ensure Miss Ashworth understands the full truth of what she has entangled herself in, since you seem determined to paint such a flattering picture of your own motives. Charlotte, this is neither the time nor the place, the Duke said, his voice hardening into something colder than Alina had heard from him in weeks. There is never a convenient time for the truth, is there? Charlotte replied, stepping fully into the parlor with the confidence of a woman accustomed to commanding every room she entered. Tell her, Sebastian. Tell her that our families had an understanding for years before that ridiculous auction, an understanding your own father encouraged, an understanding you abandoned in a single reckless moment driven by grief and misplaced guilt. Tell her that beneath whatever affection you claim to feel now, you will always wonder what your life might have been had you honored the arrangement everyone expected you to fulfill. Alina stood frozen, watching the confrontation unfold before her, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat, her earlier fragile hope threatening to crumble beneath the weight of Charlotte's furious accusations. The Duke turned to face Charlotte fully, his expression settling into a calm, unshakable resolve that seemed to draw strength from some deep well Alina had not seen him access before. There was never a formal understanding between us, Charlotte, and you know that as well as I do. There was hope on your part, perhaps encouraged by our family's shared history. But hope is not a promise, and I made none to you. I am sorry if that truth wounds you, but I will not allow you to twist it into something it never was, not in my presence, and certainly not in Alina's home. You would choose her, Charlotte said, her voice cracking slightly with a fury that seemed, beneath its sharp edges, to carry genuine hurt as well. A girl with nothing, over everything our families built together. I would choose honesty over convenience, the Duke replied evenly. I would choose a woman whose kindness has never once required an audience to prove itself genuine, over a woman who has spent weeks constructing lies, designed to wound an innocent person simply because her own pride could not bear the disappointment. I am sorry, Charlotte, truly, that you have been hurt by how matters have unfolded. But your campaign against Alina ends today in this room, and I will not tolerate its continuation beyond this moment. Charlotte's composure finally shattered entirely, her carefully maintained mask slipping to reveal something rawer and more vulnerable beneath. For a moment, Alina almost felt a flicker of pity for the woman, understanding, however imperfectly, the particular pain of watching a future one had long assumed simply dissolve into nothing. But the moment passed quickly as Charlotte straightened her spine and gathered the remnants of her dignity around her like a cloak. You will regret this, she said, though the threat carried less conviction than her earlier fury. Society will not forget so easily what I have revealed, whatever pretty words you offer in her defense. Society forgets a great deal, given time and better gossip to occupy its attention, the Duke said quietly. I find I no longer particularly care what society chooses to remember or forget. My concern now is only for the woman standing beside me, and whatever future she is willing to build with me, regardless of what anyone else believes about it. Charlotte left without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she swept from the parlor, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Alina's aunt, who had watched the entire confrontation from the doorway with wide, astonished eyes, quietly withdrew to give the couple a moment of privacy, though propriety demanded she remain within calling distance. Alina turned to face the Duke, her heart still racing from the intensity of the scene that had just unfolded. You defended me, she said softly, still somewhat stunned by the fierce conviction in his words. Publicly, without hesitation. I would defend you 1,000 times over in any room before any audience, he said, taking her hands in his own. I told you the truth earlier, Alina, and I meant every word of it. Whatever began this connection between us, whatever grief or obligation first brought us together, has grown into something entirely separate from its origins. I love you. Not the memory of a promise, not the shadow of my brother's dying wish, but you, exactly as you stand before me now. Alina felt the last remnants of her doubt finally begin to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that spread through her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long, gray storm. I love you as well, she admitted, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing as she spoke them aloud for the first time. I have for some weeks now, though I fought against admitting it, afraid of exactly what Charlotte tried to convince me was true. Then let us prove her wrong, the Duke said, a smile breaking across his features, warmer and more unguarded than any she had seen from him before. Together before all of London, so that no whisper or rumor can ever again cast doubt on what stands between us. The final grand ball of the season arrived a fortnight later, hosted at the Wolversley townhouse itself, an event grander than any Alina had yet attended, with every notable family in London filling the glittering ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers that seemed to hold the very stars within their light. Alina arrived on the Duke's arm dressed in a gown of deep gold silk, a color he had chosen himself, insisting it matched the warmth he saw whenever he looked at her. Whispers followed her still, as they always had, but Alina found she no longer feared them the way she once had. She walked through the crowded room with her chin held high, her hand resting confidently in the crook of the Duke's arm, meeting every curious stare with a calm, steady grace that seemed to quiet even the most persistent gossips before they could fully voice their doubts. Midway through the evening, as the orchestra paused between dances, the Duke surprised her by leading her to the center of the ballroom floor, before the assembled crowd of London's most powerful and influential families. He raised his hand, and the room gradually fell silent, curious murmurs rippling outward as every eye turned toward the couple standing beneath the glittering chandeliers. "I owe many of you an explanation," the Duke began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom, "for events that have caused a great deal of speculation this season. I will not waste your time with lengthy justifications, but I will say this. Months ago, I made a choice at a charity auction that many of you found confusing, even scandalous. I bid on a woman none of you knew, for reasons I was not yet prepared to share." He turned to face Alina directly, his gray eyes warm with an emotion she had once believed him incapable of showing so openly. "That choice began as the fulfillment of a promise, made to my brother before his death, a promise to look after the daughter of a man whose courage I could never fully repay. But what began as duty has become the greatest joy of my life. Alina Ashworth is not a debt I owe. She is the woman I love, completely and without reservation, and I would have all of you know it plainly, so that no rumor or scheme might ever again cast doubt upon the truth of my heart." He knelt then before the entire assembled ballroom, drawing a small velvet box from his coat pocket, and opening it to reveal a ring set with a single, brilliant stone that caught the chandelier light like captured fire. "Alina, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not out of obligation, not out of the promise that first brought us together, but because I cannot imagine a future that does not include you at my side?" Alina felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, no longer caring who witnessed her emotion, no longer fearing the whispers that would surely follow this moment through every drawing room in London by morning. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted into applause, genuine and warm, as the Duke rose and slipped the ring onto her trembling finger before drawing her into an embrace that felt, for the first time since that fateful night at the auction, entirely free of doubt or hesitation. Somewhere in the crowd, Alina caught sight of Lady Beaumont, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and further back, near the edge of the room, Lady Charlotte Vane, her expression unreadable but her posture noticeably less rigid than it had been in weeks, as though some long-held tension had finally, quietly released its grip. In the days that followed, the story of the Duke's public declaration spread through London faster than any scandal Charlotte's whispers had ever managed to create. But this time, the story that circulated was one of genuine romance rather than cruel speculation. The gossip sheets that had once mocked Alina as a plain, penniless nobody now praised her as the woman clever and kind enough to capture the heart of London's most guarded Duke. Alina found the sudden shift in public opinion almost as dizzying as the scorn that had preceded it, though she took care not to let either extreme define her sense of herself. Their wedding was set for early autumn, a modest affair by the standards of the ton, held in the small parish church where Alina's father had once served, a choice the Duke insisted upon himself, understanding better than anyone the significance of honoring that quiet, humble place where two families' fates had first become entwined. Lady Beaumont attended, along with a small gathering of true friends rather than the vast, glittering crowds that typically filled such occasions, and Alina found the intimacy of the day far more meaningful than any grand society spectacle could have been. As Alina walked down the simple aisle of her father's old church, dressed not in elaborate silk, but in a gown of soft ivory that her father would have recognized as entirely her own taste, she felt his presence keenly, as though he watched from somewhere just beyond her sight, finally at peace with the daughter he had raised and the man she had chosen to spend her life beside. The Duke waited for her at the altar, his composed exterior cracking just enough to reveal the depth of emotion he rarely allowed the world to see. And when their eyes met across the small, quiet church, Alina understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that whatever had brought them together, love had long since claimed the whole of it as its own. The years that followed brought changes neither Alina nor Sebastian could have fully predicted on the night their paths first crossed beneath the candlelight of a crowded ballroom. Alina settled into her new life as Duchess of Wolversleigh, with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every difficult season before it, refusing to let the grandeur of her new title chain the fundamental kindness that had first drawn her husband's genuine affection. She continued the charitable work that had once brought her to that fateful orphan's home, expanding it considerably now that she possessed the resources and influence to do far more than a single shawl offered to a shivering child. Within 2 years, she had established a proper school attached to the home, staffed by teachers she personally interviewed, and funded through her own careful management of the estate's charitable accounts. Sebastian supported every initiative without hesitation, often joining her on visits despite the demands of managing his vast holdings, finding in these quiet acts of service a way to honor his brother's memory that felt far more meaningful than any grand monument could have offered. Lady Charlotte Vane's fortunes took an unexpected turn of their own in the seasons that followed. Whether humbled by her public failure or simply weary of the games she had played for so long, she withdrew gradually from the sharpest edges of society's rumor mill, eventually accepting the courtship of a wealthy merchant's son whose fortune, if not his lineage, matched the grandeur she had always craved. Elinor encountered her only rarely after that, at occasional gatherings where their paths crossed with polite, distant civility, the old animosity worn down by time into something closer to mutual, wary respect. Elinor never forgot the cruelty Charlotte had shown her during those difficult early months, but she found, to her own surprise, that she no longer carried bitterness toward the woman, understanding perhaps better than most the particular pain of watching an expected future dissolve into something unrecognizable. Elinor's aunt remained a constant, beloved presence throughout these years, moving into a comfortable cottage on the Wolversley estate that Sebastian arranged for her without being asked, understanding instinctively how much her steady presence meant to his wife. Mrs. Whitfield often remarked, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had worried herself sick over her niece's future, that she had never imagined such happiness could grow from such an uncertain and frightening beginning. Lady Beaumont, too, remained a cherished friend, her sharp wit and formidable presence a source of both guidance and genuine affection as Elinor navigated the complexities of her new role. It was Lady Beaumont who first suggested, with characteristic directness, that Elinor use her position to advocate more broadly for reforms in how orphaned and impoverished children throughout the country were cared for, a suggestion that grew, over several years, into a network of similar schools and homes established across multiple counties, each one bearing the quiet influence of the vicar's daughter who had once stood trembling on an auction platform, believing herself worth nothing at all. Sebastian, for his part, found in Elinor a partner whose honesty never wavered, even when the truth proved difficult to speak or to hear. Their disagreements, when they arose, were settled with the same directness that had characterized their earliest, most uncertain conversations, neither willing to let unspoken resentment fester into the kind of cold distance that had once defined so much of Sebastian's guarded life before her. He spoke of Edmund more freely as the years passed, finding that sharing his grief with Elinor, rather than carrying it alone, eased a burden he had assumed would never lighten. Their first son, born nearly 2 years after their wedding, was given the name Edmund in honor of the uncle he would never meet, a decision that brought tears to Sebastian's eyes when Elinor first suggested it, though he insisted, through a rare display of open emotion, that it was the finest gift she could have offered him. Word of their story spread well beyond the drawing rooms of London in the years that followed, told and retold with each passing season, until the details grew softer and more romantic with every repetition. The scandal of that first night at the auction transformed gradually into something closer to legend among the young women of the ton, who whispered to one another that even a plain girl with no fortune might yet capture a duke's heart, if only she remained true to herself through whatever trials fortune placed in her path. Elinor herself paid little attention to how the story was told beyond her own walls. She knew the truth of it better than anyone, the fear and uncertainty of that first terrifying evening, the slow, careful building of trust between two people who had both learned, through loss, to guard their hearts closely, and the eventual hard-won understanding that love, however complicated its origins, could grow into something entirely its own, strong enough to withstand gossip, scheming rivals, and even the shadow of grief that had first brought them together. On quiet evenings, long after the excitement of that first tumultuous season had faded into comfortable, settled happiness, Alina would sometimes find herself standing at the window of the estate's grand library, watching the sun set over the same grounds where a fire had once claimed so much, and where new life and new hope had since taken root in its place. Sebastian would join her there most evenings, wrapping his arms around her with the same quiet certainty that had grown between them over years of shared joy and occasional sorrow. And together they would watch the light fade into evening, grateful, each in their own way, for the strange and unexpected path that had brought them to this life together. She had come to that ballroom years earlier believing herself unworthy of notice, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening spent unseen at the edges of a world she did not belong to. Instead, she had found a love that asked nothing of her but honesty, and gave in return more than she had ever dared to imagine possible. The veil that had once hidden the truth between them had long since fallen away entirely, and what remained beneath it was something far sturdier and far more precious than either of them had known to hope for on that first uncertain night, when a duke's raised hand had changed the course of two lives forever.